Hello, Professor Sicker here for the first session of our course. And as the one-word title of this text and context class indicates, we'll be devoting the entire semester to a study of a single type of literature, tragedy. We tend to use that word tragedy quite freely today to refer to catastrophic events of all kinds. We speak of a tragic explosion or a tragic car crash, for example. But as a literary term, tragedy has a much more precise and time-honored meaning. It refers to a genre, that is, to a specific kind of literary production. In this case, tragedy refers to a type of drama that originated in ancient Greece and that after 2.5 millennia continues to be written and performed even today. Now, it's true that novels and short stories may describe tragic events, but strictly speaking, only tragic plays belong to the genre that we refer to as tragedy. Well, during the course of the semester, the 14 plays that we'll be studying are going to allow us to trace the development of tragedy from the 5th century BC in Athens to the 20th century. And I'm going to devote the first part of this introductory lecture today to sketching for you the conditions out of which tragic drama arose, to its staging, to the conventions that we'll see in the 3 Greek tragedies that we're reading, and to the myths or legends that form the subjects and plots of these original ancient tragic plays. Now, tragedy first arose in Athens, Greece, over 4 centuries before the birth of Christ. It was at a time when the city-state enjoyed enormous political power and a cultural sophistication unrivaled by any other Greek city-state, including the militaristic state of Sparta, Athens' longtime enemy. Drama, both tragic and comic, began in Athens at an annual religious celebration held in late March called the City of Dionysia, which honored the god Dionysius, who was the patron of wine and drunkenness, but also of music and artistic expression. And Dionysius was also the god of rebirth, of life out of death, of rejuvenation, if you will, because in the myths associated with Dionysius, he is torn to pieces and then reconstituted, rejuvenated. And this was the central religious mystery, this mystery of regeneration that the Athenians worshipped at his shrine, at his temple, which was on the southern slope of the Acropolis, that hill that rises above Athens. Well, the first tragedies that were performed at the festival of Dionysius, called the City of Dionysia, were held in Dionysius's honor, and they were quite different from what we find decades later in classical Greece in the plays of the 3 towering dramatists of that epoch, all 3 of whom we are reading. First Aeschylus, then Sophocles, and finally Euripides. In the beginning, tragic performances in the theater of Dionysius during this festival consisted only of a chorus of young men who sang together in a single voice and danced rhythmically as they sang. They would recount a tragic subject from legend or myth as part of the religious observance. In short, the dramatic enterprise, such as it was part of the liturgy, if you will. There was, in these choral performances in the beginning, no enacted plot in these performances, nor even any characters at the start. Those elements evolved only over time. Eventually, however, we do find the emergence of an individual character in these performances who is distinct from the chorus. This was a single actor on stage who would respond to the chorus as they told the tragic story. Later, Aeschylus, the oldest of the 3 great Greek tragedians, introduced 2 characters, and not long thereafter, Sophocles introduced plays that had 3 characters. Now, in practice, a single actor might very well play more than one of those roles, but the fact is that all of the characters, once they were introduced as individuals, were separate from the chorus. And as that happened, the function of the chorus itself changed. They didn't have to tell the story so much now, because the individual characters on stage were enacting that story. And this contributed, I think, greatly, this introduction of actors, to the competition that was central to the festival, in which three dramatists each year would vie for a prestigious prize. And not surprisingly, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides each won that prize multiple times during their careers. But it's important to remember that the city of Dionysia wasn't just an artistic event, though we certainly tend to think of it that way now. It was from its origins first and always at the same time a religious celebration in which everything that was sung or danced or performed took place around or in the vicinity of the altar of the god Dionysius. Now, at the same time, the festival also became, after it was well established, a political extravaganza because it was an annual state-sponsored event. Each year, a city magistrate appointed three prominent citizens to select what was called a choregas, okay? That is, they selected a man who was responsible for hiring a chorus of about 50 young men and another chorus of 50 young boys to perform. Now, before the tragedies began, one or both of these male choruses would, at the start of the festival, perform what were known as dithyrambs. These were rhythmic songs in praise of Dionysius, intoned while the young man danced in a circle. Now, this was the beginning of what proved traditionally to be a 3-day competition that was the main event of the City of Dionysia festival. The tragic plays, in which other choruses played a part, singing their lines in a single voice, as a single composite character, and dancing as they did so, were part of the tragedies, of course, that followed. Now, no longer assigned the task of telling the play's well-known story, the choruses that we'll find in Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides comment on the situation that is at hand, reflect on the action, and very often advise the tragic protagonist. Now, at this time, the prominent citizens of Athens were divided socially and politically into castes or tribes within the city, and the men of any particular chorus were all members of the same tribe or the same sect within Athens. As a result, there was a considerable investment of civic pride and social status at stake in these contests, beyond the literary ambitions of the competing playwrights. Thus, you have a festival that is at once artistic, political, and religious. Now, the Greek tragedies staged under these conditions reached their apex of brilliance in the mid-5th century BC, 450, in that vicinity, because it was at that point that all three of the great classical tragedians that we'll be reading were competing simultaneously in the city of Dionysia. Aeschylus's Agamemnon, Sophocles' Electra, and Euripides' Medea, the plays we're studying, were all written and staged during this period of sustained brilliance. And in accordance with prevailing practice, these three dramatists not only composed their plays, but they also were required to direct and perform in them, which they did. Within the rules of the festival, each year, each March, three playwrights competed, and they had been chosen in advance. And each of these competing playwrights was required to write and produce not just a single tragedy, but a tragic trilogy, that is, 3 plays. Now, the most famous instance of such a trilogy is Aeschylus's Oresteia, of which the play Agamemnon that we're reading is the first in this 3-part cycle. It is followed by the Libation Bearers and finally by the Eumenides, which continue the story of death and suffering within the house of Atreus. Sometimes the 3 tragedies that each of the competing dramatists were required to write formed part of a single story, as is the case I've just described with Aeschylus' Oresteia. But other times, the 3 tragedies in the trilogy were largely unrelated to one another, more discrete. Now, one play from each of the 3 dramatists' tragic trilogies was performed in a given day, So the audience then saw 3 trilogies in competition over 3 days. And then each of the competing dramatists was required to cap that trilogy with the composition of a farcical comedy, which then played on the 4th day of the festival. This was known, this farcical comedy, as a satyr play, named for the comic goat-man hybrid of classic mythology. In these comic slapstick performances, actors would dress up as satyrs and behave irreverently, even mocking the gods. Now, one assumes that after 3 days of agonizing tragic drama, the audience sitting in the amphitheater in Athens was in need of such comic relief. If you look over the titles of the plays on one of the printout that I sent you, you'll notice that these titles reflect that the plays often treat the same characters and the same stories, because all of the characters and all of the stories in Greek tragedy are drawn from Greek mythology, or perhaps what ancient Athenians might have regarded as some version of their cultural past. Now, many, but not all of these myths or legends that we find in Greek tragedy that form the subject are derived from Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were composed and sung orally about 300 years before the Greek dramas that we're studying. These epic narratives include the story of Agamemnon's return to Argos, where he had been king, that we find in Aeschylus's tragedy, and that we'll begin discussing first on Tuesday. Well, put simply then, the ancient Greek tragedians did not invent stories or plots or characters. It just wasn't done. Instead, they used what they inherited. They used what was given. They used the tales that had been passed down from their cultural past over centuries, generations. What makes great Greek tragedies distinctive and moving and complex, then, is not the story itself, which the Greek audience would have known well, but rather it's the playwright's interpretation of the characters and events. It's the nuances of the motivation imparted to these characters. It's the psychological complexity and ethical ambiguity that Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides build in to dramas founded on well-known stories. Now, as a result, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides produce very different dramatized interpretations of the same basic narratives, especially, as we're going to see, the story that informs Aeschylus's Agamemnon and Sophocles' Electra, both of which concern the murder of King Agamemnon after he returns from the Trojan War and the repercussions of that killing on his children, Electra and Orestes, who mourn their father and pursue revenge against their father's killer, their mother Clytemnestra, and their uncle Aegisthus. All 3 of the great playwrights wrote versions of Electra's story, and all 3 also produced versions of another figure in Homer's The Iliad, Philocrates, a famed Greek archer. But many of the tragedies that are referenced in ancient documents, unfortunately, have been lost. In fact, only a small percentage of the works that the great triumvirate of Greek tragedians produced still survive. We have only 7 by Aeschylus, though he was believed to have written at least 70 plays. We have only 7 by Sophocles, and we have just 19 by Euripides, who composed at least 90. Now, as you read Aeschylus's Agamemnon for next class, and as in future you read Sophocles' Electra and Euripides' terrifying Medea, it's helpful to envision what these tragedies might have looked like on stage 2,500 years ago. And to do this, it's important to bear several stage conventions in mind that I want to talk about now. First, all of the actors and all of the members of the chorus would be performing in large, elaborate masks made of painted linen or lightweight wood, perhaps. The choral masks were identical because, as I've noted, the chorus constitutes a single character, while the masks of the individual characters Electra or Medea or whoever, were more individualized. And these masks reflected the character's personality, the changing situations, and the changing states of mind that the character experiences during the course of the play. And so, characters often change masks during the performance of a tragedy as the circumstances and their feelings changed. A second important convention of classical Greek tragedy is that all of the actors, again, both the characters and the chorus, were male, something that would in fact remain true nearly 2,000 years later in Elizabethan England on the English stage, where Shakespeare's plays were performed, male and female parts alike, only by men. Now, Athens was a democracy, but only to a point, and the dramatic performances by men exclusively reflect a decidedly patriarchal social structure. Just as only men could act in the tragedies, so too only men were allowed to attend the performances. They would sit proudly with members of their own tribe or caste and support and cheer for the players from that group who were assigned to any particular play. Now, looking at the titles of some of the surviving plays, you'll note that many of the tragedies are surprisingly, in light of what I said, concerned with women, including Sophocles' Electra and Euripides' Medea. And this begs the question how those roles would have been enacted, how those central characters could have been portrayed. Well, the obvious answer is they were portrayed by men, specifically by young men whose voices were high enough to imitate or give the sense of a female voice. And they would have been also dressed as females. Now, at times, Euripides in particular plays with this convention of female impersonation on stage by slyly commenting on it in his plays, as for example in the Bacchae. Here, a sexually repressed but curious king named Pentheus is persuaded to dress up by a stranger as a woman so that he can safely go out into the forest and watch what is reported to be a band of women in wild revelry under the inspiration of the god Dionysius. They're apparently out there drinking wildly and slaughtering wild animals and devouring them raw. Well, Pentheus is curious, but it ends very badly for him because as he's sitting in a tree, he is discovered, pulled down, and torn to pieces by these frantic females. But for much of the play, we then have a male actor preposterously playing a male who is within the play pretending to be a female. This is Euripides' ironic reminder that all female parts, after all, are being enacted on stage by men. More than either Aeschylus or Sophocles, Euripides' plays are preoccupied with the plight of women under patriarchy, from the tragic Trojan queen Hecuba to Agamemnon's doomed daughter Iphigenia, who are two of his heroines. Now, a third convention that needs bearing in mind, I think, as we try to imagine the staging of these Greek tragedies, is that the plays that we are reading are not just dramas, but they are also poetry. That is, the lines that the characters speak and the chorus sings or chants were written in ancient Greek in verse, that is to say, in metered lines of poetry, not prose. And some translations in English, of course, are cast as poetry to replicate this as closely as they can. Now, because they were written this way, Aristotle, whom we'll talk about shortly, when he analyzes and codifies Greek tragedy, he refers to its authors not as playwrights, but as poets, because they wrote verse drama. Now, by the same token, Homer's epics were also composed in verse, if you will. But it's worth noting that though they were composed in verse and sung aloud, we don't speak of them as tragedy. However, the tradition of tragedy written in verse continues all the way into the 16th and 17th century in the works of Shakespeare and Racine in France and other great tragedians. But unlike Shakespeare And unlike the tragic dramatists who followed Shakespeare from the 17th century into the 20th, the stage action in classical Greek tragedy was very minimal, at least by comparison. The plays would have seemed static in relation to later tragedies, and there are two reasons for this. First, because all of the action in a Greek tragedy takes place in a single location. There are no shifts in place. Even when a new scene begins, we remain in the same locus. And this practice is called the classical unity of place. Everything on stage must, from beginning to end, occur in one site. Greek tragedies are also aided in this respect by what is called the classical unity of time. We don't skip over days or weeks, years, or even hours in Greek tragedies, as we do, say, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, where months pass, or Antony and Cleopatra, where years pass. No. Or even Othello, where perhaps just 2 days pass, but still very different from what we find in Greek tragedy, because then there are no time gaps in the stage world. To put it another way, it takes the audience the exact same amount of time to watch the play as it does for the play to transpire within the world of the characters. Audience time and stage time are identical. Thus, unity of time and unity of place. Thus, what we'll see is that everything that occurs in Aeschylus's Agamemnon is confined not just to a single locus in front of the palace, but to 2 hours or thereabouts on stage and for the audience. Now, a second convention that makes Greek tragedies seem static by comparison with later tragedies is that the dramatic action consists almost entirely of conversation. Now, these conversations, of course, reveal the situation and create heightened tension as new pieces of information emerge. And the chorus's response to this information usually consists of urgent speculations and fearful predictions. Yet, paradoxically, the climactic central events of nearly all Greek tragedies, with all of this conversation, the climaxes are usually violent actions, such as the murder of Agamemnon, or Oedipus gouging out his own eyes, or Medea slaughtering her children. But the key is, the audience doesn't see this climactic event, this bloodshed the play has been building toward. We don't see it on stage. The acts of bloodletting that so many Greek tragedies build toward occur off stage, always behind the scenes. There are no stabbings, no knife fights, no sword play, no mutilation for us to witness, as there are, say, in Shakespearean tragedies like Macbeth or Othello. The audience would, in the time of the great Greek playwrights, have heard groans and gasps from behind the scenes to indicate that violence was occurring, but one of the steadfast rules of Greek theater was that we're never permitted to see the acts that are causing those groans and shrieks. Nevertheless, these acts still seem horrible and viscerally disturbing in Greek drama because they are reported at length by messengers who have indeed just witnessed the carnage. The messengers' descriptions, many of them very lengthy, are so vivid that they leave little for the audience to imagine. They make us see clearly what our eyes don't behold. The audience would feel as if they had actually beheld what is described and would respond appropriately with horror and fear. Now, these feelings are sometimes reinforced because the audience does see the after effects of the climactic violent acts. We see Oedipus's bloody eye sockets when he staggers back onto stage. We see Medea's children draped over her chariot, bloodied and dead by her own hand. We see Pentheus's severed head after he's dismembered by the frenzied Dionysian women in Euripides' The Bacchae. Now, in trying to envision what a tragedy performed at the City of Dionysia festival would have looked like, you must imagine a few physical details, structurally. First of all, try to envision a stage that has very few props on it. and by stage, I don't necessarily mean an elevated stage, as you'll see, a performance space. The emphasis in Greek tragedy is on the images conjured in the audience's mind through the power of language, not by elaborate costumes or trappings or objects that are meant to simulate a particular scene. Most of that is left to our ability to envision it based on the playwright's power to evoke it linguistically. But in the absence of such things, what did the staging of a Greek tragedy look like? Well, if you look at the diagram of the Theater of Dionysius that I sent you, you'll note first that the plays were performed in an amphitheater that was erected in front of the altar of the god Dionysius, appropriately. And based on archaeological work, we know that this amphitheater would have been constructed in circular tiers of wooden seats that could hold approximately 1,400 spectators. Most of them would have been looking down on the action from the rising tiers. The actors and the chorus performed in the area surrounded by these circular tiers that was known as the orchestra, as you can see on your chart, which the word orchestra in the original Greek means dancing place, because remember, this is the area where the chorus sang and danced its dithyrambs before the tragedies and competition were staged. And it was there where, before we have individualized characters in Greek drama, the chorus would have stood and chanted the story and sung and danced the story. Now, at the back of this orchestra, where the action or conversations take place, at the back of the orchestra and facing the spectators was a space called the proscenium, where at first the few stage props that were being used would be stored. Eventually, though, this area became a slightly elevated platform as such and gave rise in its elevation to the word proscenium, which refers to stage. So this is where our concept of a stage emerges from, this proscenium at the back of the orchestra. Now, directly behind the proscenium was a low building made of wood or stone called the sken. Originally, this structure was used by characters to change their masks and costumes during the performance. But before too long, dramatists like Aeschylus and Sophocles found that they could use the facade of this little building and its doors of the small structure for dramatic purposes, so that speeches would sometimes be delivered from the roof of the sken, and characters could enter the orchestra and perform by coming into or out of its doors, sometimes in stunning and surprising ways, entrances and exits. And most notably, it was behind the sken that the imagined bloodshed was thought to be taking place, so that out from behind the facade and the walls, one could hear shrieks. Those groans and cries would reach the audience's ears, though they wouldn't see what was going on. Now, there was one other resource the Greek tragedians had to create dramatic stage effects just beyond the power of language. And this was a crane-like device known as the machina. It was used to raise and lower characters onto or off of the stage. And it was most famously employed, this machina, in plays to show gods descending to earth from up above. Usually they would be riding in the machina and would descend in it from over the roof of the sken into the orchestra area. Very striking, very dramatic. And the fact that it was so often used for the descent and elevation back to Mount Olympus of the gods is what gave rise to the well-known term that we still use today, deus ex machina, meaning the god in the machine, which in its literal register was precisely what you would find in Greek tragedy. But today, when we speak of deus ex machina in a figurative sense, we refer to any sudden, unexpected event that resolves a situation. Now, to give you a clear idea of what a tragedy staged in ancient Greece might have looked like, I have attached with my email, you'll note, a link to the first half of a production of Aeschylus's Agamemnon that was mounted in 1983 in London by the esteemed British director Peter Hall. This staging tries to emulate some of the original conditions of the Theater of Dionysius by using masks for both the characters and the chorus, and also by casting men in the parts of women, most importantly, a man playing the role of Clytemnestra. You'll note that the chorus in this production sometimes chants and sings in a single voice, as they probably would have in ancient Greece, but at other times different members of the group intone lines that are meant to come from the chorus as a whole. Now, I invite you, urge you to watch the entire 50-minute selection that I've set. I think you'll enjoy it, but I hope that at very least you will sort of move through it and look at different parts to get a sense both of the staging and of the dramatic conventions that the director is trying to reproduce here. Okay, now, in preparation for our consideration of Agamemnon on Tuesday, I want to give you some background on the story that Aeschylus adopted from Homer, which forms the plot of the entire Oresteia, which is, by the way, the only complete trilogy that still survives among those written by the three great Greek tragedians. But before I give you that background, a few brief words about Aeschylus himself, who was the oldest of the great Greek playwrights, and who set an extraordinarily high standard of moral and psychological complexity in his plays for Sophocles and Euripides to rival. Well, Aeschylus was born near Athens into a noble family in 525 BC. He fought in Athens' triumphant war against the Persians, and he won the annual competition of the Theater of Dionysius numerous times, and he also traveled on occasion to the Greek colony of Sicily, where he died at the age of 69 in what literary tradition at least holds to be a bizarre accident. Allegedly, an eagle carrying a turtle in its talons mistook the playwright's bald, shiny head from up above for a stone and dropped the tortoise, as this particular bird species is wont to do, onto what the bird thought was a rock so that the turtle would break its shell and the raptor would be able to eat its flesh. But unfortunately for both Aeschylus and the hawk, the turtle landed on the dramatist's head, mistaken for a rock, killing him instantly. Who knows? One would like, I think, to believe this. Now, Aeschylus wrote the Oresteia trilogy just 2 years before that untimely demise, and it is unquestionably his masterpiece. Now, the audience, remember, would know well the story and the characters in their outline from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. It's a multi-generational chronicle of murder and revenge and atonement that Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides all found irresistible and all predictably treated during their careers. And all of this story concerns the house of Atreus, so-called, and the terrible curse that afflicts 3 generations within this extended family. It is a curse that we find working its way through the plays that originates long before Agamemnon, but it hangs over the play, just as the curse hangs over Sophocles and Euripides' versions of Electra, which is a generation later still from Agamemnon. Here's what you need to know by way of background about the house of Atreus that is so central to Agamemnon and also, as we'll see, to Sophocles' Electra. Okay, Agamemnon's grandfather, Peleus, was the king of the Greek state of Argos, whose central town was called Mycenae. And Pelos has 2 sons. You can see I've diagrammed this for you. Atreus and Thyestes. Now, Thyestes one day angers his older brother by committing 2 transgressions. First, he seduces Atreus' wife, and then he also contests Atreus' right to the throne as the older male. In retaliation for these crimes, Atreus banishes Thyestes, but then he deceives his brother in a truly monstrous way. Atreus lures Thyestes and his entire family, Thyestes' wife and children, back to Argos for what he says will be a reconciliation. But instead, Atreus kills Thyestes' children, all except one, and then serves them up unknowingly to his brother in a meat pie. Certainly give him more than a case of indigestion. Well, when he discovers what he has been eating, in his rage and horror, Thyestes curses his brother Atreus and curses all of his descendants before then fleeing into exile, taking with him the one son who escaped the slaughter, and that is Thyestes' son Agestheus. Okay, he will play a role, as we shall see, in the first two plays we're studying. Okay, Atreus' son, Agamemnon, falls victim to this curse that has been laid upon the house of Atreus, and is murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and his cousin Agestheus, Thyestes' son, who becomes Clytemnestra's lover while Agamemnon is off leading the Greek army for 9 years during the Trojan War. His homecoming is not what Agamemnon expects. Now, Agamemnon's children also inherit the curse, especially Orestes, who is the focus of the second two parts of Aeschylus's Oresteia, that is, libation bearers and Eumenides. But also inheriting this curse and suffering is Orestes' older sister Electra, who is the focus of plays by both Sophocles and Euripides, both titled Electra. Well, before the start of the Trojan War, Agamemnon, remember, Atreus' oldest son, has inherited the throne of the kingdom of Argos. But he also has a brother, Menelaus. And this is important. Why? Well, because Menelaus is married to Helen, who is the sister of Agamemnon's own wife, Clytemnestra. According to legend, these daughters of Zeus and the mortal woman Leda, who Zeus raped in the form of a swan, were hatched from the same egg, and they marry these two sisters, two brothers. Okay, now as I'm sure you recall, Helen is a pivotal figure in this entire legacy because she is, turns out, the most beautiful woman on earth. And the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love, gives Helen to the Trojan prince Paris as a reward when Paris favors Aphrodite over her rivals Athena and Hera in a kind of mythological beauty contest. Well, the problem is that he had been promised the most beautiful woman in the world, but the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, isn't free. She's married to Menelaus. So, how to get around this? Well, with Aphrodite's help, Paris abducts Helen from Argos and sails with her across the sea to Troy on the coast of Turkey, much to her husband Menelaus' outrage and the indignation of his brother Agamemnon. Well, they summon warriors from all of the Greek city-states, and they plan to sail across to the coast of Turkey to Troy to retrieve Helen and punish the malefactors. Thus begins the nearly decade-long Trojan War. But, and this is crucial, before Agamemnon and his assembled men, including the great heroes like Odysseus and Ajax and Achilles, before they can sail, they must first placate the goddess Artemis. Remember, she is the virgin goddess of the moon. And she is holding them back by suspending the wind that they need to sail because she is angry at the leader of this army, Agamemnon. She's angry at him because Agamemnon shot one of Artemis's sacred stags in her sacred grove and bragged about it. Okay, so having caused the winds then to die down so that the fleet for days and days and days can't sail, she demands reparation. She demands a particular form of atonement. Specifically, she insists that Agamemnon sacrifice his eldest daughter, one of his 4 children, Iphigenia, before she will restore the necessary breezes. Agamemnon doesn't want to do this, of course, but he does, and he certainly does so against his wife Clytemnestra's wishes. One can hardly be surprised at her disinclination to have her oldest daughter essentially murdered to appease a goddess. And so, you'll note with this, the legacy of children barbarically killed within the house of Atreus continues. We recall the slaughter by Atreus of his brother's children and served up in a meat pie. Now, as I think you'll probably recall, the Trojan War ends after nearly 10 years, only when the Greeks use an idea advanced by Odysseus to trick the Trojans, who have been holding off this siege. The Greeks build a huge wooden horse, present it to the Trojans as a departing peace offering, and then pretend to sail away. Well, when the besieged Trojans joyfully and with relief see this, they wheel the horse inside the city walls, and the Greek warriors who had been hiding inside climb out in the dead of night, slaughter the royal family, sack and burn the entire city of Troy. Agamemnon, as commander, is hailed as a hero, and he expects to be greeted as one when he returns to Argos, his home kingdom, immediately after this victory, with Helen in tow. In the meantime, however, over the between 9 and 10 years that he's been gone, Clytemnestra has been seething with rage at the sacrifice of her daughter, and has also enjoyed the status of power and control in the kingdom without Agamemnon there, and has also, importantly, taken Agesthus, you'll recall, Thyestes' son and Agamemnon's cousin, as her lover. Okay? And Thyestes, not surprisingly, has inherited his father, and Agesthus has, not surprisingly, inherited his father Thyestes' hatred of the Agamemnon side of the family, and his desire to murder Agamemnon in much the same way that this will continue in the next generation. Okay, this is all his desire in killing Agamemnon to avenge his own father Thyestes, and also avenge the deaths of his siblings who were slaughtered and served up in a crust. In short, Agesthus wants to enact his father's curse against the house of Atreus, okay, to make it real, to enforce that curse. So even before we get the plays that concern the 3rd generation, plays dealing with Electra and with Orestes, even before that, we see in Aeschylus's Agamemnon the legacy of revenge and violence that has been transmitted from the 1st generation, Thyestes and Atreus, now to the 2nd generation, to Agamemnon and Agesthus. Okay, both together and individually, Clytemnestra and Agesthus then have multiple motives for wanting to kill Agamemnon. And Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, it's interesting to see, interpret these various motives and lay stress on different ones in quite distinctive ways. Now, in the 2nd play in Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy, Libation Bearers, Orestes returns under what he feels is a terrible obligation to avenge the death of his father Agamemnon, both for himself, but also at the urging of his sister Electra, who is obsessed with mourning her dead father, whom she loved perhaps a bit too much, thus the origin of the term in psychiatry, the Electra complex, referring to a daughter's overweening and potentially sexualized devotion to her father. Well, the Libation Bearers concerns Orestes' agonizing moral inner conflict, his struggle when he returns to Argos. He feels that both divine and family justice require that he kill his mother to avenge his father. But Orestes knows that matricide is also an unnatural act for which he will be haunted not just with personal guilt, but very likely be punished afterward by the gods, as indeed he is. Now, in the third part of Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia, in the Eumenides, both divine justice and the psychological need to punish himself require that Orestes be tormented by winged harpies called the Furies, screeching bird-like female creatures dressed in black with wings. Now, in one sense, these Furies are actual supernatural entities sent by the gods to punish and torment Orestes for killing his mother, for that sin against blood ties. But in another sense, they are the outward manifestation or expression of the guilt that torments him for killing Clytemnestra, thus something that he psychologically brings to bear upon himself as a form of self-torment. Now, in this terrible state, Orestes appeals to Apollo at Apollo's shrine in Delphi, where characters constantly go for very often cryptic disclosures of what they should do or the meaning of things that they cannot understand. But the god of reason, Apollo, the god of prophecy, says, okay, I will purify you, Orestes, of your blood guilt, yes, but I cannot remove the Furies. Thus, in a sense, he absolves Orestes, but he cannot remove the Furies as a form of divinely imposed by Zeus punishment. He says only the goddess Athena is allowed to do this. That is her assigned task, the adjudication of such matters. Well, Orestes then goes and appeals to Athena, and Athena, the patroness of Athens, appoints a group of mortal men to judge Orestes for killing his mother. And after hearing all of the facts and the circumstances and why he felt he had to do it, they acquit Orestes of manslaughter, after which Athena persuades the terrible Furies to become benevolent patrons of mankind, and she changes their names from Furies to Eumenides, which means the kindly ones of Athens. They become a benign presence, almost a kind of guardian angel-like presence. So, Aeschylus's trilogy then, as a whole, ends with peace and reconciliation on earth, with a restoration of order and reason, a restoration of law and civility, things that the ancient Greeks valued. And this comes only after the lawless brutality and barbarism that marks Agamemnon, the play we're reading, but which we also find in Sophocles and Euripides' Electra plays, and really the barbarism and brutality and lawlessness that we find in the entire prior history of the house of Atreus, beginning with the quarrel between Atreus and Thyestes, his brother. Now, over the course of the Oresteia, then, we find a movement from savagery to civilization. But that movement, that progress, clearly requires intense human suffering across 3 generations. And human suffering is, after all, the essence of tragedy, if you think of it, in any age. And so one of the eternal questions that tragedy raises, beginning with the ancient Greeks, is the extent to which the suffering protagonist, be it Agamemnon, Orestes, Electra, Oedipus, Antigone, or Medea, the extent to which that suffering protagonist is free to act on his or her own will, and on the other hand, the extent to which everything that happens to the individual is circumscribed, predetermined by the gods or some higher power. In short, the question of the extent to which there is free will, and therefore the extent to which the individual can be held responsible for his or her own actions and moral judgments. A second major question that we're going to be considering, not just in Greek drama, but throughout this semester immersed in tragedy, is what exactly is required to make a tragic hero? What constitutes one? beyond the simple fact that the individual is suffering, because of course there are many individuals who suffer who are in no way ennobled or tragic. Now, this is a complicated and important question because some central figures in Greek drama, I think beginning with Agamemnon, are deeply flawed and not entirely sympathetic, and in some ways even rather off-putting, and yet they are the titular tragic heroes. Well, the question leads us, conveniently to the final topic that I want to consider in today's introductory lecture, and that is Aristotle's enormously influential definition of tragedy in all of its parts and manifestations in his treatise, The Poetics. Now, in this work, Aristotle identifies, defines, codifies, and analyzes every aspect of Greek tragedy, from plot to the nature of tragic character to the impact that tragedy has on its audience. Now, we've come to think of these pronouncements as the governing principles of Greek tragedy, but it's crucial to understand that they are less a set of strict rules than a collection of what we might think of as theoretical guidelines that were formulated by a philosopher who advanced them a full century after Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote the plays. Okay? Aristotle didn't see them being performed. He's over 100 years later. By Aristotle's time, that glorious epic of dramatic creativity was over. In fact, it ended in 405 BC, rather abruptly, with the catastrophic defeat of the Athenian army by the Spartans. In Sparta's takeover of Athens, the city's enlightened democracy fell into ruins and was replaced by a stern military presence that imposed autocratic rule and that brought the theatrical competition of the City of Dionysia festival each March to an end. Well, looking back at the plays then, over 100 years later, as he does, Aristotle derives from them principles that he believed explained their structure and characterization and effect on the audience. And in doing so, in examining these aspects of Greek tragedy, Aristotle formulated the first and most influential theory of tragedy, one that every writer of tragedy thereafter for centuries had to contend with, beginning with the ancient Roman tragedians like Seneca, who embraced Greek drama and thought of it as a cultural export, and continuing through Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare and Jean Racine in the 16th and 17th centuries, all the way to Henrik Ibsen and Arthur Miller in the 19th and 20th centuries, all of them acutely aware of Aristotle's theory of tragedy. All of them, these writers, either had to honor Aristotle's ideas in full or in part, or else to challenge Aristotle's basic precepts of tragedy. But I want to stress at the start that we're going to see that even the Greek tragedies we're studying don't always fit Aristotle's theories and sometimes seem blatantly, in fact, to violate or contradict them. I want to turn now to some of the excerpts from the Poetics, which I included as an attachment to this lecture. So I suggest that you look at these extracts as I'm commenting on them, okay? Well, let's begin with what Aristotle sees as the structure of action, or what we might call plot, in a tragedy. He states that the task of the playwright, after all, is not to invent new plots, but rather, quote, in returning to the same families and well-known events again and again, to adapt these ancient stories that have been handed down, quote, from generation to generation, to adapt them, quote, inventively and skillfully. Well, where does the invention lie if the story is already set? We'll see. Aristotle insists that as a genre, tragedy is capable of that kind of inventiveness depending upon the language and psychological insight of the poet, of the dramatist. He also insists specifically that as a genre, tragedy is exclusively, quote, a dramatic form, not a narrative one. In other words, if one were to recast a tragic play as a narrative story, it would be sad, but only in its dramatized form does it qualify, Aristotle tells us, as tragedy. Okay? Thus, again, my opening suggestion that when we talk about tragedy, we're talking about a type of drama. Now, the stories, Aristotle says, of course, must be adapted from Homer or other sources. But, of course, Homer didn't write tragedy. He wrote epics. And according to Aristotle, those epics, while they may be grand, are not tragedy in themselves. Well, according to Aristotle, if you look at the structure and plot of Greek tragedy, you will find that there are two key events that are always present and that distinguish and mark tragedy as a particular literary form. He calls these two events in the tragic plot or structure the peripeteia, which means reversal, and the recognition. Let's start with the peripeteia. It is, Aristotle says, the change of fortune in the action of a tragic play to the opposite state of affairs for the protagonist. For the protagonist, this change is almost always one from a position of power and satisfaction to a state of misery, loss, and even death. And as we'll see, this is certainly the case with Agamemnon, who arrives home triumphantly only to be tricked and assassinated. Now, Aristotle stipulates that these reversals of fortune that are so central to a tragic plot must operate in accordance with what he refers to as, quote, probability or necessity. By this he means there must be some plausible, believable basis for the reversal. There must be a cause for that effect that we can trace and understand and find believable. The other important structural principle that Aristotle notes is the one I had mentioned, recognition. Here, Aristotle's paradigmatic example, as he cites so often and in so many ways in the Poetics, is Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. It's a play about a man who unknowingly, years before, in fulfillment of a prophecy, has killed his father and married his mother Jocasta and had children by her. He didn't know this. Oedipus's discovery that he has inadvertently then committed patricide and incest is the ultimate moment of what Aristotle describes as terrible recognition or self-discovery, the awareness of the actual state of things and of what one has done or is. And Aristotle says that such recognitions are essential. They are pivotal in tragic plots. He describes recognition as, quote, a change from ignorance to knowledge, and it is one that often involves the disclosure of close blood ties, as, for example, in Oedipus's discovery of what he has done to his own parents, killing one and having sex with the other. Now, usually, the protagonist in Greek tragedy comes to this discovery, but sometimes it befalls other characters, though Aristotle does not note this. In fact, we're going to see that this kind of revelation can come, say, in Electra, when Clytemnestra discovers that the stranger who arrives, in fact, and claims to be carrying the ashes of her son Orestes is, in fact, Orestes himself, who she thought and hoped was safely dead. No. Now, Aristotle writes that the most dramatically effective recognitions are those that carry what he calls, quote, the emotional shock of surprise. And the most famous and controversial part of Aristotle's tragic theory describes his description of the type of character who suffers this shock and surprise. That is to say, the type of character that qualifies for tragic heroism. What kind of an individual, to cite a question I had raised earlier, is a tragic hero? What are the parameters? Well, first, according to Aristotle, the tragic figure must be an individual of illustrious background, an individual of, quote, great reputation, the kind we'll encounter in the plays we're reading, who derive from great families of significant social magnitude, kings and queens and princes and generals, individuals who are important because their fate is going to have an impact on the life of the entire society around them. Only such individuals, according to Aristotle, qualify as tragic heroes because, he suggests, the consequences suffered by the tragic hero must ripple out beyond the individual and threaten the entire social order. Okay, now Aristotle also says that such individuals qualify as tragic heroes when tragedy is an imitation of persons who are better than average, but by no means perfect, because, quote, unqualified good human beings must not appear to fall from good fortune to bad, because this would strike the viewer as merely unjust and repellent. Put it another way, the tragic hero must not only be a person of great social significance from a well-connected, illustrious family, they must not be fundamentally villainous. Tragedy is the imitation of individuals who are better than average, basically noble, but not perfect, as he says, because an unqualified good human being falling into misery merely fills us with a sense of injustice, which is, to the viewer, repellent, not tragic, off-putting, repellent. So a tragic hero then must be one who Aristotle says is morally, quote, between moral extremes. And this would be a person, he says, who is neither perfect in virtue and justness, nor one who falls into misfortune through vice and depravity. You don't want an individual who is absolutely saintly. That won't qualify for a tragic hero. And you certainly don't want who is riddled with vice and depravity either. It must be an individual more good than bad, but with an intermixture of vice and virtue, not perfect. Now, Aristotle explains that when a dominantly evil man suffers a reversal, as we've seen always recurs in Greek tragedy, when that happens to a depraved or evil man, it's not tragic because we feel that the individual has gotten exactly what he deserves. On the other hand, when a totally virtuous character suffers a fall from grace, we're moved to revulsion rather than to the specifically tragic emotions, which I'll explain in a moment, that Aristotle says are necessary to mark a tragedy. An ideal tragic hero, then, is someone who is fundamentally noble and decent, but not perfect, but nonetheless an individual who, in his or her imperfection, is not infected with what he calls, quote, any real badness or wickedness. So what causes the individual's fall into suffering, then? What causes their misfortune? Well, it is here that Aristotle invokes the most widely debated and famous term in his entire model of tragedy, and that word is hamartia. The tragic hero, Aristotle writes, succumbs to misfortune, to the reversal that is central to the plot, not through any innate evil or depravity, but rather, quote, through some hamartia. It's a rather slippery word that is often translated as a miscalculation or an error in judgment, okay? The fall resides in some mistake that the individual makes that has terrible consequences. However, generations of readers of the Poetics have taken Aristotle's word, hamartia, to mean a tragic flaw, so-called. That is, some specific weakness in an otherwise noble or virtuous character that causes the protagonist's downfall, be it Agamemnon's pride, or Medea's jealousy, or Electra's paralyzing love for her dead father. So it's true that in many Greek tragedies we really can identify what one might call some kind of tragic flaw. But I think it's notable that these weaknesses, and again, Aristotle does not mean hamartia as tragic weakness. Nonetheless, when we do find them in Greek drama, those weaknesses of the kind I've just described usually function by contributing to the protagonist's miscalculation or error in judgment. The inner flaw in a generally noble nature, in other words, seems to drive that hamartia, that error or that miscalculation that leads to the catastrophe. Well, the ultimate test of what makes a tragedy for Aristotle the most important thing, is the effect of the hero's reversal and recognition and suffering on the audience. To qualify as a tragedy, Aristotle says, a play must fundamentally evoke, quote, pity and fear. These are key words, and probably, I think, the most important words in the Poetics. Fear, Aristotle explained, comes to the audience through our ability to identify with the protagonist, which is possible when he or she is, as we've seen, according to Aristotle, good but imperfect, just as members of the audience are clearly morally imperfect. Our fear, Aristotle writes, quote, is aroused by our seeing someone like ourselves, someone who is suffering suddenly and catastrophically. When we see this, Aristotle says, we are afraid that such a cruel reversal could similarly befall us. And we feel this because we identify with the protagonist. But for Aristotle, this fear in the audience must be accompanied by a second tragic emotion, pity. And our pity, he explains, quote, is aroused by seeing someone who undeservedly falls into misfortune. Undeservedly is, I think, an important qualifier here. Even though this may happen, this fall, because of the individual's miscalculation or error in judgment deriving from some inner flaw, nonetheless, we still feel pity for that individual because he or she suffers far more than they deserve. Well, the last key term we need to consider in Aristotle's theory describes the result of our experience of pity and fear as we are watching the play. These prove to be profoundly productive emotions. Aristotle writes, quote, through the representation of pitiable and fearful incidents, the audience experiences catharsis. By catharsis, Aristotle means a psychic and emotional purgation or cleansing through our intense engagement with and identification with the suffering protagonist. As a result of this catharsis, Aristotle says, the experience of watching a tragedy, of all of these terrible, sad events, is ultimately therapeutic and beneficial to the audience. We come out purged and improved. So much so that Aristotle refers to the feeling of pleasure that actually comes to an audience from watching and responding to a tragedy that is enlisting our pity and our fear. We may weep and we may tremble, but it is all part of a psychic cleansing, a catharsis that leaves us feeling healthier. And it is a salutary source of pleasure in and of itself, in its ability to make us feel purified. Well, in reading the plays this semester, I think you should ask yourself whether these beneficial effects that Aristotle described match your own experience. Some would say, some would dispute that. Do you leave the text or do you leave the theater feeling as if you have been purified, or do you leave feeling merely depressed? Well, when we meet on Tuesday for our first synchronous session online, I want to concentrate on roughly the first 2/3 of Aeschylus's Agamemnon. That is up until Cassandra's entrance, which comes in line 1067 on page 144 of the edition that we're using and that I hope you all have. Please be sure to get that Penguin edition. The Robert Fagles translation is excellent. It has a superb introduction, and it's important that we're all reading the same text, particularly in translation. So I look forward to seeing you all on Zoom this coming Tuesday at 1 p.m. for our first foray into Agamemnon, and I'll send you all a link to that in advance and an invitation to it in advance. And when we meet, please be sure that I can actually see you in whatever nook or cranny you happen to be in at that moment. Till then, have a good weekend and be safe.